Great. Thank you so much for having me. So excited to be here. I love all things related to the Enneagram. I was first introduced to the Enneagram years ago. I've had my own coaching business now for the last 7 years. I actually used to work in retail. I did sales and wholesale, so I know what it's like to be on that side of the business, and then I know what it's like also to run your own business. And for me, the Enneagram was really life-changing when I understood my type and my motivation. It really helped me run my business more efficiently. And I think that's kind of why we are all here, right? To learn from each other how to run a more effective and efficient business, and then also to understand how to manage our relationships, right? Whether they are personal or professional. So the Enneagram has no boundaries, and I'm looking forward to sharing more about it with you today. And if you haven't taken the test before, you don't know your type, I just encourage you to look at all the types and try to see what resonates with you. I mean, a lot of us are fairly self-aware and we know our behaviors. And if you can kind of align with a certain Enneagram type, it'll kind of make this presentation more effective. And then I'm really looking forward to, after I go through my deck, talking about the types and answering some questions, right? So really some questions that might really help you with your business while we're here this morning. So I'm seeing we have some 8s, 2s, 3s, maybe a 4, and we'll see what else shows up as we go on. So I'm going to share my screen here with you. We can get started. Okay. Okay, so talking about the Enneagram and entrepreneurship, how to thrive as a founder using the wisdom of the Enneagram. So as I said and was introduced by Allison, I'm Allie Dunn. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm an Enneagram 7, which means I am an enthusiast. And I love supporting women in business. So my clients I do team building. So I do using the Enneagram as a communication tool for team building. I've done Airbnb, I've done Johnson & Johnson, I've done, my local yoga studio. So I work with all different types of companies. And then I also do individual leadership and Enneagram coaching for women in the founder and professional space. And really supporting women in business and leadership is my passion and mission and calling. So our outcomes for today, what I'm hoping you'll get out of today is, greater self-awareness, understanding how the Enneagram can support your business and your goals, and then unlocking your potential and uncovering blind spots. I think depending on how much work you've done on yourself, how self-aware you are, the blind spots are the things that hold us back, right? So we kind of run into barriers on a daily basis. And if we just don't have that awareness of those repeating patterns or limiting beliefs, we can get stuck. Talking about your strengths, right? Really leaning into your strengths and then understanding where to delegate. And then also connect with each other, right? I think part of this work, of course, and what, the retail playground and Up Next is building is community, right? How can we leverage community and how can we support each other? So thinking about the Enneagram, what is it? I mean, this could be, a 2-hour presentation, but I just wanted to give you the high level. My goal is always like, what can I share with you that's not on Google, right? What can I bring to you from my experience? So it really just means 9 points. And the Enneagram talks about motivation. So when you think about when we meet people in a room or we're talking to people, sometimes we can see behaviors, right? I can see someone going to get a glass of water. I can see when someone shows up late, but we don't know the motivation or the underlying reason. So with the Enneagram, we can't really make assumptions. So even having done this for so many years, I probably am right maybe 75% of the time with clients initially. And until we do the assessment and do more of a deep dive, then can I really understand their core motivation. The why of the Enneagram is around frameworks. People love frameworks. They love quizzes. They love things they can attach to. And it's just easier when you have a formula. And then the how, right? So how do you find out your Enneagram? I know that there is a free assessment that we have a link for, had one for through Truity. So that's kind of, I would say, your baseline. How can I find out my type? And then working either with a coach or doing an assessment, a kind of higher level professional assessment will help you understand your Enneagram type. Okay, so while we go through this presentation and while we're here today, I just want to ask you to reflect on what your number one struggle is in your business right now. Because interestingly enough, a lot of these potential struggles that you might have can relate to the Enneagram. And so for you, it might be like big picture visioning, right? Where is my business going? It also might be hiring, right? Maybe that's an area that's really hard for you. Finances could be difficult, planning and delegating, mindset and confidence. I mean, I think across the board, that's something that I think we all struggle with. Marketing and sales or product development. So you'll see as we go through that certain Enneagram types have a natural affinity for certain things here, and then also a natural aversion for certain things. And so we want this workshop to be beneficial for you, right? So we want you to feel great. So identifying your type would be kind of the first priority. And then thinking about your superpower and your blind spots. And then I would love when you walk away today just to create one action step based on your superpower to propel your business forward, right? What's one thing I can do today based on what I've learned? And then I also invite you to listen to all the archetypes, because the point of the Enneagram is not to just live in your default type or behavior. It's actually integration, right? So if you show up as a certain point, that's where it's easy for you. The idea is that you're pulling from all the types to have a more holistic approach to working in your business and in your life. So I'm going to kind of do the high level of all the types, and then we can talk about it more in depth after. Specifically, I don't think we have a one in the group, but I always like to go over all of them because, again, we do have all the types inside of us. So with the type 1, I don't actually know if Michelle Obama is a type 1, but I feel like she has type 1 tendencies. So the 1 is a strict perfectionist. And so the motivation for the 1 is to do the right thing. 1s are highly moral, high integrity. They're very conscientious. They're very organized, very disciplined. And so I tend to see 1s ironically, in the organizer space. I've worked with home organizers in their businesses who are type 1s. I see them in more tech and science roles, right? They're really organized, really efficient. And then the blind spot for a 1 is they tend to wear their emotions on their face. So their presence, you can kind of sense their energy if they're upset or they're angry, and they kind of suppress, right? They tend to suppress their emotions. So for their superpowers, if you are a 1 or you're working with a 1, extremely high standards, strong ethics, quality, control, responsible, all of those things. 1s can be really hard on themselves and hard on others. They have probably what I would say is like the most intense inner critic of all of the Enneagram types. And then when you're thinking about delegating, if you're a 1, you don't want to be messy, right? 1s do not like things that are out of order. They do not like chaos. So if you are a 1 or you're working with a 1, just note that perfection is so important to a 1 that it's hard for them to step out of that. So they might have like analysis paralysis. They might have a hard time, even in the creative space, right? Because their limiting beliefs are like, it must be done right and it must be done one way. So just food for thought if you either are in a relationship with a 1 or working with a 1 or are a 1, that just delegate the messy stuff, because it's going to drive you crazy and you're going to get stuck. And I've seen that before. And then our type 2s is the considerate helper. So I know we have 1, 2 in the group so far that I saw, and then maybe a 2-wing 3, maybe Allison. So the motivation of the 2 is connection and to essentially be liked. And so they're focused on relationships, they're caring and supportive, and they're very people-centered. So 2s are often in leadership, they are empowering people, they love to mentor, they love to teach. But the blind spot for the 2 is that they can be over-focused on others, right? So they spend a lot of their time wondering how other people are. They walk into a room, they assess the needs of the group, and they're externally focused. So if you are a 2, you are in your business incredibly talented at building community, right? Client care, you're intuitive, you love partnerships, you're builders, right? You're all about like community and connection. And where a 2 can get kind of stumble is in delegation, right? And in boundary setting. So if you are a 2, figuring out how to take care of yourself, how to fill up your cup before filling others. And I think as women in general, we tend to all have some of this in us, right? And specifically when you're running a business, if you have a partner, if you have family, whatever it might be, like how do you take care of your needs while you're still supporting those around you? Sales can be hard for twos if it's transactional, because twos really like things to be authentic and meaningful. And so if you are just doing like a cold calling for a two isn't necessarily what they want to do. You might want to put that with someone else who's a little bit more efficient oriented and less concerned about the outcome or the kind of feelings around it. And then systems and structures sometimes for twos also just don't light them up. In all the twos that I've worked with, it's more about relationship building and connecting, empowering, networking, right? Twos are really good at kind of keeping everyone healthy, happy, and engaged. Okay, so our type 3 is a competitive achiever. I think we have some wing threes in our group. And so the superpower of the three is actually really being adaptable. A three can walk into a room, go to a cocktail party, talk to the CEO, talk to the associate. It doesn't really matter. They have this kind of like chameleon superpower. They're competitive, they're ambitious, and they're all about goal setting. So they're very action oriented. So if you are a three and you're leading your business, you're going to be very high paced, very quick and very efficient. You're great at marketing, pitching, visibility, all of that, but you also have a tendency, you can make mistakes because you're moving too quickly. And threes do need to slow down, but for them, that is really the hardest thing because they want to get to the finish line and they want to win. So the blind spot for a three sometimes is they're so image conscious, they're over identifying with their image. So they lose touch of who they are and people sometimes don't trust them. For example, like a four and a three sometimes can be hard because fours are such authentic Enneagram types and threes sometimes can be more surface oriented. So sometimes just thinking about like that motivation, this idea they want to succeed. And so as a three, you want to delegate things that slow you down, right? You want to have a team who's going to do kind of like the tech stuff for you. And also for threes, it's really important for them to connect to their feelings. Even though they are a heart-centered Enneagram type, their feelings get locked and they have a really hard time accessing them. So understanding their own identity, understanding kind of that inner work is really helpful. And then also, I think that threes, although they can be inspiring leaders, sometimes their team can feel disconnected a bit. So because they're moving forward and because they're doing all the things. So sometimes I think a three is best suited if they have a two next to them, kind of helping to lead the people. And not that we can kind of control of this, and we certainly don't use the Enneagram as a hiring tool, but it's an incredible tool when we think about the missing links, right, in our business. So what am I really good at? What am I missing? So when you are hiring someone, you're thinking about what are these traits that I need and how to ask maybe the right questions to fill in the gaps. Okay, so our type fours are intense creative. And so fours are known as like individualists. We call them the deep sea divers because they feel so deeply. They are a heart-centered Enneagram type and they're motivated by being unique. So their core desire is to be unique and their core fear is being ordinary. And so sometimes fours can have this longing of wishing their life was different or seeing that everyone else has life easier than them. For their superpowers, they're insanely creative, design-oriented. They connect with clients, again, if they are authentic. A four will not work with you if they do not respect you and do not see that you are an authentic human being. So that is just like a core value of a four. But I would delegate if I was a four, like anything related to logistics, data, financials, anything that kind of takes away from their creativity and decision-making that is, too like emotional. So the work for the four, I always say when you're thinking about your Enneagram type, when you know what your motivation is, you also need to work on the other part of it, right? So you have these strengths, but then sometimes the strengths can become too much and they can become too much of a good thing. So like fours, the work for a four is actually to be more logical, to be okay with being boring, to be okay with being ordinary, to be okay with it just being a job versus everything having meaning. And I'm sure our fours on the call are shuddering at the thought of something not having meaning, right? I'm excited to hear feedback on that one. And then type fives, I don't see as many fives in the entrepreneurial space as I do in other areas. So certainly fives, because their motivation is to understand. They're very cerebral. They use logic for everything. They're very methodical. They have the strongest boundaries ever. So if you have a hard time setting boundaries, look to a 5 to teach you how, because they just literally will go into a cave and never come out. Or maybe if your partner is a 5, understand that if you're an emotional sign, they are a logical one. And so it's very hard sometimes to feel that connection. And I think that in the entrepreneurial space, because you have to be so visible and so social, I think that 5s tend to want to be behind the scenes, right? So working in like science, data, research, all of that. And so they tend to be detached from feeling. But if you are working with a 5, like a brilliant partnership is like a 7 and 5. So a 7 is a visionary, 5 is more logical. They like could, do 5 can do your product and 7 can do your visioning. And so there's things like that where partnerships can work out really well. And so they're great at teaching, great at problem solving. And then for delegating, if you are a 5, anything that has to do with relationships, anything that has to do with partnerships, networking, anything that's energy draining, because they just like to live in their little cave. And they're a little bit more introverted, or tend to be. And then we have our 6s. We may have 1 6 in the group that I know of so far, possibly. We're considering it. So 6s are team players. They're really loyal. They're reliable. They crave security, and they like to plan. They want to know all the things, and they're assessing risk 100% of the time. So sometimes the blind spot for the 6 is that they can focus on what might go wrong, and they can live with a bit of like a low-level anxiety. So generally the catchphrase from the 6 is that I'm worrying about all the things so you don't have to. Or when things go wrong, a 6 says, I already knew that was going to happen. I'm not surprised, because they've just literally analyzed every possible thing that could happen. So they're great planners. They're incredibly loyal. Once you have their trust, right, you need to work on building trust with the 6. It's very important. And then for delegating for the 6, like low impact decision making, because the 6 will get stuck in analysis paralysis. So just like things that don't mean a lot, just like delegate them. And then just working on kind of that anxiety, right? And working on kind of attaching to your heart and your body, and getting a little bit less out of your head. Then we have our 7s. I know there's a 7 in the group, and myself as well. So 7s are incredibly optimistic, future-oriented, right? And it's interesting because some of the types are future-oriented, present-oriented, and past-oriented. So for example, a 2 is kind of oriented to the past. They will make present and future decisions based on past experiences, where a 7 is going to make impulsive decisions based on what's happening in the moment and looking towards the future. So they want freedom and focus, and they connect ideas with ease. So the blind spot are their reframers. They have a hard time sitting in the dark or the sadness or the darkness, and they can be impulsive, right? So if you're working with a 7, having the 7 slow down, like working with a 7 to kind of complete the cycle, is really, really important, because they're high energy, visionaries, branding, all of those things. But where they need to delegate is sometimes the follow through, time management, operations, and spreadsheets, because they just don't like that structure. And then we have our 8s. We're almost done. We've got 8 and then 9. 8s are active controller. We have some 8s in the group, that I know. And 8s I tend to see, certainly at the executive leadership level, 8s like to be in control. They like to be leaders, and they're definitely action oriented. So they trust their instincts, and they get into action when some of us are still at the back kind of thinking about what to do. And so the one thing about the 8s that people don't talk about a lot is they're really justice oriented. So 8s tend to want fairness. If you are part of their team and they respect you, like they will be the rock. They will be the leader. They will ensure that you get what you need. The blind spot around an 8 is just unaware of their energies. So they can be very direct. And for all Enneagram types, it can be difficult, right? Because people approach situations differently. So like the work for the 8 is to kind of understand their direct energy is not for all. The same as the other Enneagram types that are less direct, their work is to try to lean into that, right? So I think we're all trying to meet in the middle here. And I think that that's kind of a clue for how to work with each other. From the entrepreneurial superpower, bold, decisive, and confident. And they can handle conflict. But then from a delegation point, sometimes like 8s are just not interested in dealing with emotional labor. They don't necessarily want to deal with like the softer side of things. So whether that's hiring a really good person to do your team leadership and your management, and then also working on your own vulnerability. Because generally with an 8, it's like core motivation is to be in control. Core fear is vulnerability. And then for our last one is the peacemaker. And I don't think anyone put that they were a 9 in the group. So with the 9s, they kind of sit at the top of the Enneagram and they're looking down on everyone. So their core motivation is to keep the peace. They are about harmony. They're about collaboration. They are storytellers. They are diplomatic. And you can kind of tell a 9 often by their energy. They're usually very easygoing. A 9 spend a lot of time processing. So if you're in a meeting with a 9, they really might not even talk the whole meeting, or they won't until the end of the meeting, and you won't hear from them until then. The blind spot for the 9 is they have a hard time getting into action, and fear of conflict, right? So they're not necessarily as leaders sometimes able to give their team feedback, and then also in relationships might not be advocating for themselves. But their entrepreneurial superpower is that they're calm and grounded, right? And that they have kind of a global perspective. But for what to delegate is like things that need high priority decision making. They do not like to be visible. I can't tell you the amount of 9s I've worked with who their number one feedback from their manager is to be more visible. They really do not like the spotlight. And so working with like a coach or accountability partner can help 9 step into the spotlight. So that's kind of an overview of the types. And I just wanted to touch on a few case studies of different Enneagram types so you could see what it looks like to be able to step out of your power, right? And how you kind of, because essentially you have your strengths and your challenges, which you want to be aware of both of those. And it's like, what are you doing either to lean into other different Enneagram types, or how are you kind of overcoming these barriers? So one person I work with, she's an agency owner. She has 10 people in her company. She's had this business for maybe 10 years. And so her strengths is in, relationship building. She is a selfless leader, like servant leadership, multitasker, business development. For her, she's so in the details of her work, and she doesn't want to necessarily let the work go or empower the team. So she's stuck here, but she needs to be here, right? She needs to be at that high level CEO vision. So for her, it was around, being more direct with her employees and telling them, these are the parameters of the work. This is what you need to do. And then setting boundaries, right? More self-care for her, setting more boundaries, and then just having fun. And it might sound kind of silly, but a lot of people come to me wanting more fun in their life. And I don't know if it's because I'm a 7 and that's just my job to bring the fun, but I also think it's something that people really need. Because you're not just working to live or living to work, either one, right? It's like, okay, where is the fun? So that's the kind of work that we would do together. And that's what, if you are a 2 and you notice these patterns, those are the kind of things that you need to do to get out of the weeds and to not always be in service. And then for our 7s, when I was working with a multi-business founder, so again, she's enthusiastic, big ideas, all of that. Her challenge was staying focused and then getting into the detail and product side of things and negotiating. So 7s tend to be impulsive and say yes before they think of everything. So the solution is like, hiring outside counsel. She ended up needing to get a lawyer, going through the details of her contract because she just impulsively said yes. So just know that if you are a 7, slowing down, asking for advice, getting opinions before saying yes. And when things don't work out, really facing what went wrong, like evaluating. And if you're having a hard time, call on your friend, the 6, and they can help tell you all the areas that you might have wanted to pay more attention to. And then if you're a 9, so the strengths of the 9, long-term vision, diplomacy, and then challenges for the 9 is like time management, getting into a routine, taking on other people's opinions. And so for the solution for the 9 is definitely a lot of mindset work, right? Really like leaning into your values and your purpose, and then essentially creating routines and structure. And then I just wanted to share one of the examples that happens in the hiring process is, and I've seen this at the corporate level and I've seen this at the entrepreneurial level, is that we tend to hire like-minded people, right? Like hires like, right? So this is an example of actually in my own business where I'm a 7 and I hired another 7 to do my kind of content development, social media. And we had the best conversations. and the most inspiring time together. But when it came down to it, I was like, I'm someone who needs structure, accountability, details, and more project management. And this was something that she really struggled with. And I'm not saying that I wouldn't have worked with her, but I, in retrospect, should have asked more questions, right? So if you're a 2 and you're a relationship builder and you're about the people, not that, again, you're not using it as a hiring tool, but if you're hiring someone, you might not need someone to also be a relationship builder, right? You might need someone to be like a product developer, right? You might want to look at someone who's a researcher, like looking at a 5 or something else. So I just think it's something to keep in mind as you grow your business. Even if you're hiring contractors, like what is it that you actually need? And that can just save you a lot of money and or hassle in the long run. And the other dynamic, this is a different one, right? So the 8-2 combination, right? So this is more complementary, but it requires self-awareness on both parts, right? Because if we're thinking about an 8, they want to be in control. It's harder to be vulnerable. They're very strong, but they have kind of a, a relentless approach. Let's say where a 2 has a softer approach. They want to be appreciated. They're generous and caring. And so when an 8 can understand the 2's motivation and a 2 can understand the 8's motivation, it is like so dynamic and harmonious and can just really be a beautiful partnership. But again, it's just about understanding where people are coming from. So I just wanted to highlight that piece because I think it's really important in relationships and as your businesses grow. You also can use the Enneagram when you're dealing with clients. If you know someone's Enneagram type or are even aware of the way they communicate, it can help you when you're building your relationship with them. So if I'm working with an 8, I'm just going to be direct and I'm not really going to send a lot of fluffy emails because it doesn't really matter. They don't really care, right? Where if I'm working with a 2, I'm going to send a warm and friendly introductory email and then get to the point after. So it's kind of just like a cheat sheet in a way for communication and relationships. So I just wanted to leave you with this question, and then I'm excited to dive into more of the questions you have, but like what resonated for you, and then how might your type help you get unstuck? So I'm going to go, I know all my contact info is going to be sent after the session. So I'm going to go ahead and exit this deck here, and then we can get into the details and talk more about it. All right. Hello, I'm back.
Allie, this is amazing. I'm that much more instantly fascinated by the whole Enneagram structure and hiring process, and what a wonderful web of information. Thank you.
You are welcome. I know it's a lot, right? And especially for people hearing it for the first time, it is like a big information download because there's so many juicy nuggets to it. And it just depends where you want to take it in your life.
I'd like to invite anyone to, unmic and speak up or put something in the chat if they have questions about their own type or just sort of navigating all of this, or you can raise your hands. Yeah.
Actually, I have a question. If I can go, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ellie. This is so great. And I feel sorry that I didn't do the test earlier.
That's okay.
But listen to you, you're so clear. I have 3 questions, actually.
Sure.
The first one is that someone can have a mixed personality because I identified 5 that
Okay.
every time that you described one, yeah, that's mine. And then describe another one, yeah, no, actually, that's mine. So I have 5. So if a personality can be mixed, if there is a difference, any science between the odd or even numbers,
Okay.
if they fall into a classify differently, odd from even numbers. And my last question is if would it be valid for someone else or ask some people to evaluate you, if that result would be different from what I think I am when I do the test.
Yeah, those are all great questions. So I'll kind of just work backwards. I think what I notice can happen if you're taking an assessment is depending on the level of depth of the test, it can be easy to sort of cheat the test, right? So if you're doing one of the free ones, it's like, well, I don't want to be seen as a perfectionist, right? So I'm going to choose these other answers. So that's why I use the integrative 9. It's called IEQ-9 is the test that I use because it is, scientifically, psychologically backed, and the test is adaptive. So what will happen is as you answer questions, it will re-ask you similar questions in different ways to try to kind of stop you from trying to create your own type. So it's very rare that someone can kind of control the outcome, I think, with the deeper tests. And what's interesting is what I've noticed more is someone will get their results back and there'll be some resistance, right? I don't think this is like me. I'm not sure. And then they'll show maybe their partner or their friend and they'll say, oh, that's exactly like you. Right. So it's less about, I think, what people think of us and more about our own blind spots, right? And the things that we don't necessarily see about ourselves. And then in the relationship with the numbers, odd and even doesn't matter in that space. But what in the wheel of the Enneagram and the circle, there's lines between the types. So each type has a kind of stress and strain line. So there's an area for growth in these small triangles. So it's a little bit more like deeper than what we're going into today, but there's some interesting relationships between the types. Yeah. And then the first one, I relate to so many, right? I think completely normal, right? To relate to a lot of these types. Where I think it's interesting is the types where you don't relate at all, right? The ones where you're like, you, it's like, okay, what is that trying to tell me? So I remember when I first did the Enneagram and I thought, type 1 perfectionist, I'm like, what is that? Right? I was like, I am not that. And I thought, wow, this is an area for growth, right? If I'm resisting this so much, like maybe this is an area for development and I need to be a little bit more discerning and organized about that. And then as far as your core motivation, all of us will have one type, but some people, when I do the assessments, maybe they came out as a type 2 and it's very obvious, right? It's a type 2, that's what I am. I don't have these other types. Others will have higher types, which means you have that flexibility or accessibility to other types. So at my core, for me, it's like I'm a type 7, I'm an enthusiast, I want to experience it all, but I have a strong 8, which is that kind of direct controller. So I can toggle between those two types. It's conscious, right? I'm thinking of it, but it's also can be subconscious. But even in my business, I think I need to have a tough conversation right now. I'm going to channel that 8. So when you kind of know your default, then the other ones become more available to you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. You answered all my questions. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Okay. So as a consultant, what advice do you give the most? Like what are the questions that, people are really looking for you to like guide them or as entrepreneurs, right?
Right. I think
what is that one piece of advice that you're really giving?
Well, I would say 2. I think there's 2 pieces because one is communication. So that's like one thing that I would say is kind of the heart of all of the work I do is kind of like in relationships and communication. How do I not get offended, right? How do I not take things personally? How do I work better or live better or love better with this person? So I think that's kind of part of it too. So I think that sort of starts with that self-awareness. What am I making things mean? What do I want to know about myself? And then I think from the consultant piece, I mean, at the end of the day, I think when we're talking about businesses, it's like, how do I make more money? Right? I mean, really, like, how do I drive my business? How do I get better results? So I think in that space, what I try to do is help people kind of, I would say, like define their highest level of almost like output or productivity, but that stays aligned with their values, right? So for example, a type 9 who tends to be more collaborative and more like has a sort of slower pace. For them, it's like we work on getting your structure in order. We get your routines. We set you up for success, less decision-making, more action. Where like for an 8, it sometimes can be more around like, what's the meaning here, right? Why are you doing all these things? What is this about? How do we ensure that you're taking care of yourself? So every type has different needs, but at the end of the day, I think it's about how do I live this like balanced life? How do I do great at my job and also have a good personal life? So I know that's kind of a broad answer for you, but I would say those are the 2 things, like communication and then success.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So, Allie, we have 2 questions in the chat.
Sure.
So one is from Jill. and she asks, when does the Enneagram develop and does it ever change over time? And then there's a
Yeah.
second question.
Okay. Yeah, I'll go into that one first. Yeah. So the sort of studies have shown that it develops in grade school, right? So when you are a child, and essentially a lot of it is like how your needs are getting met, right? So if we think about it in the family dynamic, a lot of times, I don't go too deep into the past when I work with clients, but I certainly ask about, parents, family values, siblings. And a lot of the times it's like people show up a certain way when they're growing up in order to fit into that dynamic, right? So as a 2, you might be someone who ensured that, you were helping everyone. I'm going to set the table. Don't worry. I'm going to do well in school. Don't worry. Like that kind of people pleasing mentality. And whether that came from your parents showing appreciation for you at the time, whether there was conflict in the house and it was the way that you stayed safe, right? There's a lot of different ways that people show up where maybe as a 7, maybe you were an escapist, right? Maybe things were harder at home and you're like, if I could just be anywhere but here, this is how I survive, right? Or a peacemaker, I'm going to step back. There's conflict. I don't want to rock the boat. So usually it happens in grade school. And then it often doesn't change over time. I mean, there's people who 100% say it never changes over time. And I don't necessarily want to live in that space, but what I think happens is that there's various integrations of the type, right? So you can kind of be like, let's call it a low level integration 7, which would be like, you can't hold down a job, you're partying all the time, you're just like over experienced. And then there's like a higher level integrated 7, which might even look like a different Enneagram type because you're responsible and you're functional and your type hasn't changed. What I think changes more is the access to the other types. So if we would have talked 5 years ago, I don't know if I could ever have found my 5, like that specialist. But knowing, okay, if I'm running this business, in order to be successful, I need to have like things in order. I need to be well researched. I need to be well educated, all of that. I've tapped into that side. So if you were able to look at levels of accessibility of all types, mine would all be quite a bit higher now based on self-awareness.
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button for a second. Okay, so then the other question, well, this kind of goes along with it, but we've also heard mention that becoming a parent can potentially influence it. And as our Allison, or I was going to say Allie, our Allison mentioned, like, is it a nature versus nurture?
Right. And I would say I have seen that a couple of times, like where there's been a shift from, let's say, for example, someone that was a 5 and moved into a 2, right? Because the 2 is the caregiver, right? Ultimately, like the 2s are so outwardly focused. And as a parent, you can't help but tap into that part of yourself, right? And that kind of selfless energy. You have no boundaries as a parent. You're not really able to say no. So I think a lot of that becomes magnified. I would almost call that like a false testing period, right? Because I think part of this work that we're all doing, whether it's as entrepreneurs or women, is like we get to a certain age or point in our life. And I think it's about return to self, right? So if I was like heavy in that space when my kids were younger, I think it was either a role I felt like I should play or something that was just inherently happening all the time. And then when because I've done like 50 different tests, when I've redone tests more and more, I'm more distant from that side of myself. One of the theories that one of my colleagues has is really like who we are in our 20s is really our type. So like we're kind of in survival mode in grade school and kind of growing up. And then we get into this like space where we kind of solidify ourselves without influence almost at that time. And then we become relationships, then we become parents, and all these things kind of start to dilute who we are. So it's almost like an arc of like, you kind of expand out and then it's like, well, wait a second, who am I truly at my core? So I think that those tendencies show up. And my 2 side was definitely more, let's say, prevalent 10 years ago when my kids were younger, where now my 8 side is more, right? So I did kind of shift, and I'm inherently still have so much too because of the work I do, right? I'm just wanting to support and empower and help people. But I think as a parent, specifically as women, that can really happen.
Completely agree. on a side note, I'm in my Freebird era, and I
Okay.
totally feel what you just said so deeply, where, even 3 years ago, I felt like I was so deep in parenting, and that shift that is just enough. And I'm feeling in the last year, I'm like, how do I get back to center, get back to
Yeah.
who I was versus like all of the things that shifted while I was like in the height of parenting. So
Yeah.
that really
Well,
resonated.
and I think about too at this time in our lives too, it's like the leave behinds, right? What are the things we want to leave behind? And I think when we're at these like critical stages in our life, it's like whether it's societal expectations, internal expectations, learned behavior of like what a good parent looks like or a good mother or all of those things, we just can kind of be trapped. And that's why these groups of community, whether it's business focused or not, to be able to share with each other and lift each other up and help us get out of that maternal space. And not there's anything wrong with being in that space, but I think as women, it's like just adding one other thing, right, to our list of like how to be great at XYZ. It's like, we don't have room to breathe.
Mhm. I love it. So actually, Rachel had a question in the chat and also
Oh,
just raised her hand. So
yeah,
Okay.
I'll just ask, we kind of went past, I'm gonna ask a different one.
Okay.
So like there's a lot of times anything I've heard about Enneagram is normally like couple focused, like who you're like the Enneagram you're married to. And there's
Yes.
kind of like sets that work well together, right? Like 2 and 5, 1 and 7, 8 and 9. My question is in entrepreneurship, when you're talking about like who should be on your team,
Yes.
does that stay the same pairings? Like does an 8 and 9 work really well together like they do in marriage, a 1 and 7? Or is that like different because it's
Yeah, like a business focus.
yeah, like
I
I'm
mean,
curious if those
yeah.
pairings carry over to business at all.
Well, and it's interesting that you say that because I think the first thing is self-awareness, right? So that's my number one, regardless of Enneagram types or anything, right? Because you can be a 6 and a 3, but if neither of you or one of you is not self-aware, then there's kind of bigger problems at hand. And I happen to be married to a 7, which is wonderful and also very trying. But we've been together for 20 years. I feel like it still can work. So I do think, but it was very enlightening and empowering when we found this out because it explained a lot of our parenting, explained a lot of our behaviors. And now we have language, right, to communicate with each other and understand why one of us thought we paid the bill when we didn't, right? So I think that self-awareness piece is huge. And so I think in the co-founder or the workspace, I think a lot of the same things can apply. I just think in my experience in working with couples or in working with teams or partnership, there isn't necessarily partnerships that are better, but I do think there is, which I think you're alluding to, this idea of like balance, right? And what could work or be more effortless, right? So I worked with like a partnership where it was a 9 and 6, right? And I think that when we look at that, there's probably less friction than you might have with other types. But for them, it's like the work was like with the 9 was like, okay, accessing her voice, right? And ensuring that she was sharing her needs with the 6. And the work with the 6 was like not to be so risk focused, right? So I think as long as you know the motivation of your colleague, your partner, and also, that complementary piece, what am I missing, right? We have a whole team of 7s, right? There's a lot of visioning going on, but like who's doing the kind of the hard work? As long as you're aware of that, I think that can be more useful. And then noticing energetically how people are showing up and what their needs are. Because I think what happens in any relationship, whether it's business or personal, is the communication piece, right? So learning the tools to communicate with each other. And like I said, 8 and 2 can be a really effective relationship because we've got our kind of action-oriented doer and we've got our kind of people-centered person. But if they're not communicating and aware of each other's kind of strengths and challenges, then that also is really hard too.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to Rachel's question in the comments because I actually really like it. And I think as entrepreneurs, you can feel a lot of stress, and a lot of like the weight and responsibility of what you're doing. So her question was, do you find that sometimes people get mistyped because they're living in constant stress and live in their stress number, especially small business owners, like a 2 coming off as an unhealthy 8?
So interesting. So I haven't noticed that as much. And maybe it just hasn't presented itself to me that way. I think it's funny because I feel like when I know their types or when we're working together and I have the types down, sometimes I don't even notice it as much as like the stress showing up in the way of another type. It's like I kind of sometimes just equate that to like a 2 in stress, right? And knowing that it's a certain way. I think knowing, the stress signals for each type, like what does it look like when your type is in stress, I think is really, really important. But I haven't seen like a type switch or a different diagnosis. It's more like this idea of, okay, if you're a 2 and you're coming across as like very stressed, what's happening? So I'm kind of looking like behind the curtain. And then it's like, okay, well, what's really happening here as a 2 is that you haven't said no in 5 months, right? Your boundaries are being like pushed, right? You have a hard time saying no. You have a story around saying no is selfish, right? So I kind of go more into like the client or the person, right? And figuring out what those struggles are. And then less so about them switching types, more just about, okay, I see you, I know what's going on. And like, how do we kind of fix this part so that we can, make you less stressed, really?
Does anyone else have any questions? This is your 1-to-1 question time with Allie.
Anything's possible.
I'll jump in with a question, but
Okay.
others encouraged to speak up. Allie, in terms of you quickly said that you don't typically use the Enneagram as a hiring tool, but I am curious if anyone does use it as a hiring tool, or maybe less of a hiring tool, but we talk a lot in the playground about collaborations. Can it be a tool for vetting collaborations or seeking out different types of collaborators that cast a wider net? Because perhaps this could be something we could study together, but perhaps different types of brands or brand categories are more generally led by different enneagrams. And how can we incorporate this information into our collaboration and hiring processes?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's really interesting that you say that. I think brands can be certain types, right? Like I think that we would say Nike is a type 3, right? I think that it's interesting, right? When you look at that and you can kind of sense like, very creative brands are going to show up as almost like a certain Enneagram type. Even countries have their own kind of Enneagram type. Like Canada is a type 9, right? I'm Canadian. So it's like we are like a collaborative peacekeeping nation, right? And it's like other types are India is a type 2, right? Very much more like, helpers, right? So this kind of interesting. So there's many layers and levels in which it shows up. And on the hiring tool front, like, because from an HR perspective, right, we don't do that as a hiring tool because it's not, can be deemed as non-inclusive, right? So I think what happens is what we do is that we use it to understand our missing parts, right? So if you sent me like a team infographic of your team, I would say, well, you know what I'm seeing? I'm not seeing any 4s. I'm not seeing any 5s. I'm thinking maybe you're hiring for innovation, right? So let's talk about that, right? So you're kind of noticing what's missing and maybe asking the right questions or understanding the superpowers of these people that you're hiring based on what's not there. And then when you think about partnerships, again, I always think it is that balance, right? Well, if we're this way, maybe they're that way. How do we do that? So I think it just depends on your needs, right? So I would just kind of look at it that way. Like you can even use the Enneagram as a tool. Like if you're looking at the Enneagram itself, you can say, I feel like we're really good at achieving, we're really good at relationship building, but again, like we're having a hard time in that innovation. Okay, well, let's try to partner, with someone else who's leading the way in, I don't know, like menopause research. Let's say you're in that space, whatever it might be, right? So thinking about it in that way, I think you can come up with some really great partnerships and some interesting connections that way.
I'm going to back up on that
Great.
only because it's interesting to think about, I guess, a different way. I talk to almost all of our brands under our umbrella at some point in time. And, one of, as we get deeper in, like one of their biggest struggles is a lot of them are like art-based, right? And they're creatives and they have this like amazing direction and all these things. But, when I ask them a simple like question of like, okay, well, what is your landed cost? Like, what does this cost? Right. And when we get down to like a number, they don't know. Right. And like, what is like the way to identify, like you're saying, a collaboration or a partnership with something that like you are both on two ends of the spectrum of that's what you're really good at. Right. And we deal with that a lot as entrepreneurs. They're amazingly wide-minded artisans.
Yes.
But the business side is not necessarily always their skill.
Exactly. And that's where I feel like in these communities or the work you do is like, that's when you just like are digging in and you're like, okay, we need operations, we need systems, we need structures, right? And that's why I was trying kind of bringing up this idea of delegating by type, right? Because a lot of, and not all, but a lot of creatives are type 4s, or maybe they're type 7s, right? So it is more like feeling, vision, ideas, brainstorming, like all this like kind of high level, or with a 4, it's like you're kind of intensely into it. But things like, yes, spreadsheets, systems, data, all those things, like for me in my business, like my non-negotiable when I first opened was an accountant, right? Like that is just one thing where I'm paying for it. I don't do it. I just know. And then that gives me the space to like build, right? It gives me the space to do the work that I love. And so I think when you're working with those people, and I don't know if you have like a certain package or program or connection or something that you offer, but I think it's kind of, they want your help, right? Like they want you, like, because we don't know what we don't know, right? So that's why we hire consultants. So it's like someone's going to come in and say like, you need da 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 da, and it's almost like you could have like that package for the creative. It's like the creative starter pack. Choose your own adventure. These are the things you need. What do you think you could do yourself, and what would you want to hire? Because ultimately, like, if we don't have our systems and structures in place, we're not going to be able to succeed, right? Like the foundation is everything. And so that's where I think the partnerships come into play too, where you can have your product side and then your kind of, idea side. And that's a great relationship, but not everyone wants a co-founder, right?
Definitely ties back to wearing all the hats and trying to figure out which one fits and which one doesn't, and you can expand. Go ahead, Krista.
Absolutely. So Natalie, actually, I think this is an interesting one. Natalie has a question. What's the best way to get to a healthy level of your Enneagram? Like therapy, probably.
Yes.
Do you have any tips, especially when it comes to the workplace?
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, there's so many things. It just, it depends on obviously like your accessibility to these things, right? So often when I'm working with people, they've usually had a fair amount of therapy before I start. So they kind of come in with, I would say, like a higher level of awareness. And then it's this next step of, okay, who am I today? What do I want? And then how does my Enneagram relate to that? So I think baseline, we all need to have therapy, in my opinion, right? So I think that's a great start. And then I think in the workplace, there's a couple of things at play, because I do work with people that work in toxic environments and there's nothing that they can do to change it, right? So you have to ask yourself, what can I control and what can I not control? And if you find, like I recently was working with someone who's a 9 and she's working in like a hostile, chaotic environment. And I'm like, this can't work for you. Like, this is a time where you're going to need to leave, because it's just where other people, an 8 might be like, it's fine, I can deal, I've got this other stuff going on. So it's just kind of, I think, knowing yourself, right? Knowing your motivation, your limitations and all that. But in the workplace, I mean, if there's things that are in your control, like communication, right? Communicating with someone at work and saying, hey, this is how I like feedback. How do you like feedback? Or, hey, this is how I like to communicate. If I'm in a meeting, I need to download, I need to walk away, and then I need to email. Please don't expect me to respond on the spot, because I just can't, right? So I think the more you can name what's going on in the workplace, the easier, the situation becomes, the less, I guess, like the less it means something, right? And I think that not everybody has the skills for communication. So I always say first stop is like work on yourself, right? What you can control. So whether that's through therapy, open conversation, coaching, whatever it might be. And then while you're doing that, look at your environment, right? And see how you can break down some of those communication barriers. Because we all know that we really can't control how people act, but we can control the way and the response that we have to how they act. So I would say that's would help you get into a healthier Enneagram just by having that awareness.
Thank you, Allie. And on that note, we are actually out of time. This has flown by. Inc- Incredibly eye-opening. Thank you so much for your time and energy and insight. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. We will send out the recording, the links to the test, Allie's contact information. Her Instagram is super fun, by the way, so definitely
I
give
like
her
to
a
keep
follow.
it funny in the Enneagram so you can identify your types. It's all, of course, of the 7, that's my brand, obviously. So come along for the ride. Thank you so much for having me, and just wishing you all a wonderful day.